Good evening, and welcome again to Public Perspective. I'm your host, Kevin McDermott, and tonight we'll be talking about people who contribute to the knowledge base of our community and make it easier for us to become informed citizens. Our guest tonight is Nancy Stevenson, the president of the Adlai Stevenson Center on Democracy. Ms. Stevenson, thank you so much for being here.
It's wonderful to be here, and thank you so much for having me.
Well, you know, the first question anyone is going to have who sees your name here is Stevenson and Stevenson Center. So, you are in fact a part of the Stevenson family.
I married into the Stevenson family. I didn't come by it naturally.
I think that's okay. In our society, that's considered part of the family.
Very good. I am the daughter-in-law of the man who ran for president twice and against Eisenhower, and the wife of a former senator from Illinois, Adlai Stevenson, and the mother of an Adlai, and the grandmother of an Adlai.
Oh, my Lord.
Oh, we have no imagination in our family.
A whole string of Adlais.
A
Right?
whole string of Adlais.
Well, welcome to the show. So let's talk a little bit about the center itself. The Stevenson Center is fairly new, is it not?
Relatively. It's been going for about 3 years. Started out very slowly because as it began to grow, the economy began to diminish. So
Timing is everything.
timing is everything, but it is moving forward and it is growing. And it's there to, well, I should back up a little bit in saying that one of the things that people cared about my father-in-law, and I think my husband as well, is that they wanted to bring people into politics, engage them in politics. They were less partisan than they were.
Certainly unfashionable today, right?
Right, but interested in the world and in participation in government. And so the center was formed really to bring that perspective alive again. The property, it's housed, it's a wonderful public-private partnership because it's now owned by the Lake County Forest Reserve District, which is supported by taxpayers of Lake County. And we lease it from them to use for programs. And that's a very nice mixture, a very nice base.
Well, it sounds like a physically very pretty and attractive place as
It's
well.
a beautiful property that, nice flat land going down to the Des Plaines River, not very large. The house is a rather simple house for nowadays. It's not one of those starter castles, but it was a very comfortable family house for my husband's family to grow up in. And so the garage is now used for a lecture hall, and there's an exhibit in what was once a sort of a storage place, and then the house is used for receptions and things of that kind, and then the fields are used for large events.
So you would set up tents or whatever out.
Set up tents
property,
or just have open air. We've had a concert out there for the Lincoln's celebration of the 200th anniversary of Lincoln. Was a concert with a program with the Lincoln portrait being played by the North Shore Symphony, which was wonderful. And that was just families brought picnics and sat on the lawn, and it was beautiful.
Ravinia outside.
Ravinia,
Right.
Ravinia Light, somebody called it, because it was cheaper.
Yeah, there you go. So the center itself, you've put together some interesting programs, and I know one that was recently on, and I think we can get on DVD, is about the presidential nomination process.
Yes.
And so how did you manage, well, generally, how do you choose the subjects you're going to study, and how did you choose that one in particular?
Well, in part because at that time, the nomination process was going. It was 2008, and very much different from the days of yore. And we wanted these politicians really to come and talk about the way it used to be and the changes and what was good about the changes and what was not good about the changes. And we had these lively discussions from George McGovern, Jesse Jackson, he was a candidate, remember?
I do remember, yes.
And my husband was there, having participated in the McGovern Reform Commission about nominating processes. John Anderson, who was a candidate for the presidency,
yes.
and Senator Lugar was there. So it was this broad range, overseen, moderated by Richard Norton Smith for one part of the program and Bill Curtis for the other. And it was a very lively series of discussions.
So that's it's interesting because that is something that, like the nomination process, for example. You know, we've been around a while, right? So we remember some of the differences. And when you talk about the McGovern reforms, you know, I remember those, but there's a large proportion of Americans who would have no idea what we're talking about.
That's right.
Right? What was the nomination process before then? And it really was very closed. The idea of these primaries is actually a fairly new phenomenon. If you recall, primaries served a different purpose back then.
When my father-in-law first ran for the presidency, he didn't run. He was drafted in 1952. He didn't want to run. He wanted to stay and finish out his second term as governor. In his second run for the presidency, he was in 5 primaries, and he thought that was a terrible burden.
5.
5.
Yes.
Or maybe it was 4 or 6, but very few. And so it is entirely different. The monies involved is entirely different.
Well, this year, I think each party is going to spend over $1 billion on the presidential election. It's $1 billion. It's astonishing. So the Stevenson Center then this seems like a previously neglected niche, teaching people about not only what is government and how does it function, but how is it changing over time as well.
We hope that history is part of it, and we hope teaching, and I'll just take a tiny step back to say teaching sounds like top-down.
Right.
And what we are hoping that the center will succeed in doing is engaging people in the conversation so that they feel that they can be participants in the solutions.
So how would that process work? How would you get people engaged?
Well, in the first place, by bringing them in to talk about these issues. And we'd like to have programs that have people who have lively viewpoints and who are practitioners, not just the academics who have a theory, but we'd like to have on-the-ground people when we can, talking about the way it really is when you're living it. And then have people ask questions and then get answers and then encourage them to go on and be engaged.
So if we take a program like that, like for example, a nomination process, what has been the outcome of that? Now it's been several years since that happened, so how do you see the effects of that?
I don't think there have been direct effects. I do think the people who thought about it again were more aware. And let's hope that they take steps. We can't order them to take steps.
Right, right.
Our next program in this whole vein, and we don't only deal with political issues, I'd like to get onto that, but the next program in this sort of general area is on March 29, if I can do a commercial.
Yes, you may.
We're having Russ Feingold, former senator from Wisconsin, and Trevor Potter come and talk about money in politics.
And now Trevor Potter has an interesting history himself that we were
talking
about earlier.
Trevor Potter may be soon a household name. He is a Washington lawyer. He was the advisor to John McCain when John McCain was working with Feingold on the McCain-Feingold campaign finance reform. And he was McCain's advisor in 2000 and 2008. So he's the conservative, and Russ Feingold is considered the liberal.
Right.
We don't take partisan. We're nonpartisan and non-ideological.
So being able to get both sides of the
It's important
question,
to us.
right?
But right now, Trevor Potter is the advisor to Stephen Colbert from the Colbert Report, and Colbert has a super PAC.
Yes, he does.
And Trevor Potter is his advisor, and it's very tongue-in-cheek.
Yes, I've actually, in fact, watching this super PAC might be something that the Stevenson Center should study after the election is over. When I look at the kinds of things that the Colbert super PAC is doing, even just down to the names that he chooses, the definitely not coordinating with Stephen Colbert super PAC, it is a way to expose what Colbert himself thinks are the absurdities of the system in a way that no straight dialogue could. The way that he brings this kind of humorous, almost prankish perspective to it, I think raises a awareness of an issue in a way that would be hard to duplicate in any other medium.
Humor should be able to be a powerful tool. It has been in the past, and it has engaged people. He did very well in the primaries, in the polls at least.
Yes,
he didn't
yes.
do well in the primaries. You couldn't go on
Well,
the
he
ballot
wasn't on
in
the ballot,
South Carolina, right? But he did well in the polls because people were watching and paying attention and listening and engaging. And, well, so that's our March.
So in March, we'll get to hear from Trevor Potter and former Senator
The two of
Russ
them together
Feingold.
having a discussion about not just, I hope, campaign reform, finance reform, but money in politics has pervaded policies.
Yes.
So that people believe that they can build pipelines or not, depending upon the monies that have been provided, or health care, or all sorts of things issues are affected by the monies that go into campaign.
In fact, that is one of the central tenets of the Occupy or the 99% movement, however you want to describe it, is the idea that government now only represents those who have the money to buy the influence to get them to move in that direction.
Right.
So it seems like a topic that's well worth discussing now, more than ever now.
We hope so. We think so. We believe so. So much so that we have gone about and putting together this program and hoping that people will come. And we're very enthusiastic about that. But I do want to say that politics has been the subject for most of our conversation. But that's not all of the issues that we want to embrace. The whole engagement of the United States with the world is something that we're very concerned about, and wanting this to be a globally responsive organization. We're very small at the moment, but we want to bring in leaders who are involved, and we've already had a few. We've had a doctor who's involved with the Paul Farmer movement in Haiti after the earthquake. He's building a new hospital in Haiti. We had him and Marge Benton talking about the results of that terrible earthquake and building new, and the cholera, trying to overcome the cholera epidemic that occurred after the earthquake. And we want to help break down some of the isolation that I think Americans have from the world.
Now, it's interesting, in the recent State of the Union speech that President Obama gave, he talked about how the perception of America seems to be changing again for the better around the world. Now, of course, he's running for re-election, so he will say that. But as the Stevenson Center looks at this issue, do you see America engaging more, engaging less, engaging better, engaging worse?
I think there's some real concerns about, one of our programs recently was a woman who's the former Commissioner General of UNRWA, which is the United Nations Works and Reliefs Program. And she was talking about refugees around the world and the desperate situation that comes from civil wars, and
Terribly devastating.
the
right.
upside and the downside of the Arab Spring. She was all hopeful about the Arab Spring, but we also see that there's been displaced peoples from the Arab Spring that need to be cared for, taken
And
care
the end
of.
of that chapter is far from reached.
Far from reached, which she addressed very intelligently and very engagingly. I don't know how many of us have a chance to understand the sort of on-the-ground situation about those refugee camps, or understand the situations that go on when we engage in wars that may have been based on oil
Or
rather than on peace.
or money in some form. Now, oil is the most common. Everyone needs it, and it's the most valuable resource to fight over now. But ultimately, it's money, control of valuable resources. Just happens
Water's
to be
the
oil
next
now.
one.
Yes, water is coming. Now, one of the interesting things I've seen in terms of interaction with the rest of the world, I had the good fortune I was able to travel to Pakistan several times in the last decade or so and work with a group that was building hospitals and schools in Pakistan. And what you see when you see the level of poverty that can exist. Now Pakistan actually has great wealth as well, but it is a highly bifurcated society. There is a very small group that controls all the wealth, and they're very wealthy. They live very well. And there is an enormous proportion who live dirt poor. And when you say dirt, that's not an exaggeration. There were shops in Islamabad that I passed, and the shop was so barren it wasn't clear to me what this fellow was actually selling. And so you see that level of disparity in the world, and talk to them and understand how the Pakistanis view the United States. Now, rightly or wrongly, there's a lot of internal problems in Pakistan that are of their own creation, and there is a tendency to blame the United States because we're the most powerful country in the world. But nonetheless, if you go and you talk to the people and you see their perspective, it gives you a new perspective on the country you live in, something I might not have recognized if I talk to someone else and see, well, gee, what's it like to live on the other side of the world in this very different country and see America through those eyes? What does that look like? And I assume that that's what we're talking about here, right, is to try to bring that kind of perspective to Americans.
Absolutely.
Right?
And the gap between the rich and the poor is growing. Here in this country, but it's also growing between countries. So that there are some countries that are getting poorer and poorer and some countries that are not. And that's another issue, as well as within the countries. And we have not really done the best job on either score.
You mean internally and around the world?
Internally and around the world. When we attack Iraq, that doesn't win friends in the Middle East.
It certainly did not at the time, no.
And it isn't likely to waging war is not likely to bring about peaceful love for the U.S.
Well, and this is what I encountered when I was in Pakistan as well, that America was seen as the aggressor. And, you know, we've grown up with the myth of America being the good guy. You know, we're the strong, silent, mind our own business till duty calls and then we respond.
Right.
And that's not necessarily the perception around the world. And certainly in Pakistan, especially during the early Bush administration years, there was a markedly different perception of this country there. Now, which allows me to segue a little bit to the problems now with Iran and the parallels to the run-up to the war in Iraq. Is that something that the Stevenson Center would address or want to take a look at?
We would if we had the right people available to come and discuss. We would love to do that. We have not yet had that opportunity, but no, we're looking for every opportunity that we can to bring people who really understand issues from on the ground and make them available to American audiences.
So how would you choose an issue? Like, for example, you know, Iran, if you were to do a show like that, I'm on television, I think of it as a show, right? To do a
Well,
program like that.
let's hope it would be a show.
Well, yes, people should feel that they've been through an enjoyable experience, right? One that
Right, right.
gives them benefit. So there are lots of competing priorities, right? You're not an enormous organization. You have to make choices. You have limited funds. No one has unlimited funds. So how do you pick and choose?
How do we pick and choose? I think we take advantage of the smart people and the generous people who will come and talk to us that we can bring, and the good luck of findings. And it's amazing to me. I have made a lot of cold calls to these brilliant people and said, would you be willing to come and have a Sunday program? And they say yes, again and again, because the people that we want to have, at least, are interested in the same things that we're interested in, which is broadening the understanding and engaging others in the conversation. And bless their hearts,
They say yes.
they say yes.
Right.
And sometimes, of course, they can't.
Now, one of the other issues that I know that the center is looking at is the changing role of media and how media
Yes,
is changing and
yes.
how that changes what happens in America. So let's talk about that a little bit, because I've actually had other guests on who have studied this. One of those academics, right? Not the boots on the ground guys, but the academics who have studied it to see what the effects are. And one of the most interesting things that was brought out is a fellow at the University of Illinois, that even though the number of media outlets has expanded explosively, the number of subjects that are covered has actually shrunk. And his theory is that it's because there's too much of an echo chamber. What happens is that the stories that get followed are the stories, it's kind of self-reinforcing. The stories that begin to get followed are the stories that more people want to follow. So it's in the computer industry, they call it the network effect. The larger your network is, the more people want to connect to your network. So that's a problem with the explosion of media, that it seems to have limited the amount of stories covered and the amount of information being conveyed. So it's a very interesting subject, and because media is changing so dramatically, the effects on society are as yet unmeasured. And that's what you guys are looking at, that same question?
We had a wonderful professor, and I'm not against academics, named Pablo Baskowski from the Northwestern University. And he was talking about this issue, and he said that there are issues of, he called them sports and games and the things that people really want to see. And then there's the ones that have been sponsored by historical media, newspapers, etc., who send correspondents to do research on foreign policy and other things. And, in other words, the things that we should listen to, quote.
Yes,
And he was sort of putting that point, should listen to. And then what people actually do. And they very often go to the sports as or the games, or the pleasure. And you broadening his theory was, and he's tested it numerically, his theory was you go to more media outlets, but the same
stories.
The same stories, the phenomenon repeats itself. I worry, and I think we all worry, that the old-fashioned, or the media that we're used to, the newspapers and the television,
media.
traditional media, they've invested in those reporters who seek out the facts. And the stray reporters can't do that.
They don't have the resources. They may not even have the training.
Right. And they don't even necessarily want to go there. They may be on the ground reporting from Tahrir Square, but they're not investigating the causes of all that.
Because that takes tremendous time and effort. We've spoken with newspaper people on the show as well, and we've talked about the kind of investment that a major newspaper, for example, has to make in a
Right.
reporter, and even an individual story that may take months or years really to develop. And can you afford to fund that reporter who's out doing this work, and there's essentially nothing you can print, so there's no work output as such? And as a business, can you continue to support that? And the answer, sadly, is becoming no. Even the major media are having trouble supporting that model.
It's a real concern. One of the things that we notice is that now Germany, France, England, Al Jazeera, others are, Japan, have national outreach programs that are supported by their governments. And they're pretty, well, they may have a government viewpoint, but they're
In these cases, they say, like the BBC in
the
Great
the
Britain.
BBC, right? They give a pretty broad base information. The U.S. is not funding things like that so much now, so it's a real concern that we're not giving the information and we're not producing that information for the world.
So let me change gears quite a bit here for a moment. If people are interested in the Stevenson Center, either to volunteer, to contribute, to get involved in whatever way, how would someone pursue interests with the center to see how they could contribute?
We have a website. It's www.stevensoncenterondemocracy.org, and we would love to hear from people. And we will send, if they want to hear about our programs, we'll send them information by either snail mail or email. And we'd be thrilled, delighted.
What kind of opportunities are available if someone wanted to, for example, volunteer?
Oh, they could come help with the Fine Gold Potter lunch.
Sure, there's the logistics of these programs, right,
Right.
that have to be put on.
And we do have some wonderful volunteers, thank goodness, because it's a 99.7% volunteer organization. So everything we do is pretty much volunteer. And we welcome them to help us think up the programs. Our volunteers do that. They help reach out.
Organize them, right?
They help organize them. They help even wash the dishes after them.
Yes.
But by and large, the most important thing they do is they give us ideas, which then we follow up on.
Well, believe it or not, we're out of time, so I hope that message reaches our audience and
I
that they
hope
will
so.
be inspired to come and
Wonderful.
participate.
Thank you, Kevin.
Thank you, Ms. Stevenson. It's been a pleasure talking to you. And thank you for joining us once again on Public Perspective.